Germany, May 1945.
In the spring
The war
of
was ending,
1945,
but hunger had just begun.
hunger became the new
In a bombed-out village near the Elbe
She
River,
searched-
a young woman named Margaret Fischer knelt in the rubble of what had been her family's bakery, searching for grain between shattered bricks. Her hands trembled not from cold, but from weakness. She weighed 78 pounds. When the American Jeep rolled into the square, dust rising behind it like a curtain, she expected nothing. Liberation meant chaos. Freedom meant starvation. But then a sergeant stepped out, looked at her for a long moment, and said three words that would change everything. "You're mine now." Those three words would echo through 40 years of marriage, 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and a life built from the ashes of total
After
destruction.
months of waiting and
This is the
oceans
story of how a
paperwork,
single chocolate
hope
bar
finally
saved a
became
life, and how one act of compassion in the middle of humanity's darkest hour created a legacy that would span generations. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the spring of 1945 when the world was ending. The spring of 1945 came to Germany without mercy. Fields lay fallow, cities smoldered, and the roads filled with millions of displaced souls moving in all directions at once. Soldiers surrendering, refugees fleeing, survivors searching. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, had collapsed in 12. The Allied armies rolled across Germany like an unstoppable tide, crushing the last pockets of resistance, liberating concentration camps, and occupying a nation that had been bombed into submission. In this chaos, hunger became the new enemy, more ruthless than any army. The Nazi food distribution system had collapsed completely. Supply chains were severed. Agricultural workers had been conscripted or killed. Bombing had destroyed mills, bakeries, and warehouses. Cities that once housed millions now held only rubble and ghosts. And in the midst of this devastation, millions of German civilians faced a simple, terrible reality. There was no food. The statistics were staggering. By May 1945, the average German civilian consumed fewer than 1,000 calories per day. In some cities, the number dropped below 800. For context, the human body needs approximately 2,000 calories daily just to maintain basic functions. Anything less means the body begins consuming itself, burning muscle tissue, shutting down non-essential systems, preparing for death. Starvation doesn't happen quickly. It's a slow, methodical process that takes weeks, sometimes months. First comes the constant hunger, the gnawing emptiness that never leaves. Then the weakness, the inability to perform simple tasks. Then the mental fog, confusion, inability to think clearly. Then the physical deterioration. Hair falls out, teeth loosen, skin becomes translucent, the body becomes skeletal. And finally, when there's nothing left to burn, the organs begin to fail. This was the reality facing millions of Germans in the spring of 1945. Liberation by Allied forces didn't mean salvation. It meant watching foreign soldiers with full bellies and abundant supplies walk through streets filled with starving civilians. The irony was not lost on anyone. Margaret Fischer was 23 years old, though she looked 50. Before the war, she had been a school teacher in the small town of Torgau, 40 miles northeast of Leipzig. Her father had run the town bakery for 30 years. Her mother had taught piano lessons in their parlor overlooking the Elbe River. Her younger brother Klaus had been conscripted in 1943 and died at Stalingrad. The family never recovered. The bakery, which had fed the town for 3 decades, became a military supply point. The Nazis didn't ask. They took. Her father continued working baking bread for German soldiers, watching his flour supplies dwindle, knowing each loaf he made went to sustain a war machine that had already consumed his son. In February 1945, Allied bombers targeting the military installation hit the bakery instead. The building collapsed in seconds. Her father, working in the basement, died instantly, not from the explosion, but from a massive heart attack as the walls came down around him. They found him 3 days later, sitting upright against the cellar wall, his hand still clutching a sack of flour. Her mother survived the bombing, but didn't survive the grief. She simply stopped eating. Day by day, meal by meal, she faded away. Margaret would prepare what little food they had: potato soup made from peelings, bread made from sawdust and grain sweepings. Her mother would stare at it, shake her head, and turn away. By March, she was gone, her body so light that Margaret could carry her to the cemetery alone. At 23, Margaret Fischer found herself completely alone in a town that no longer existed, surrounded by rubble and the constant sound of artillery growing closer. The Americans arrived on April 25th. She remembered the date because it was her mother's birthday. The fighting was brief. The remaining German defenders, mostly old men and boys with outdated rifles and no ammunition, surrendered within hours. White sheets hung from windows. The sound of gunfire stopped. And then the occupation began. Jeeps rolled through streets lined with broken buildings. Soldiers set up checkpoints. Military police began registering civilians, documenting who had survived, who had been Nazi party members, who needed to be detained for questioning. Margaret had hidden in the bakery cellar for 3 days after the Americans came, not from fear of violence. American soldiers, she had heard, were relatively disciplined, but from exhaustion. She had nothing left. No family, no home, no food, no future. The cellar walls still smelled of flour and yeast, phantom scents from another lifetime, memories of when her father would wake at 3 in the morning to start the ovens, when the town would fill with the smell of fresh bread, when life was normal. She survived on rainwater collected in a tin bucket and 3 potatoes she had buried in ash before the bombing. 3 potatoes in 3 days. Her body, already skeletal, began shutting down. She could feel it happening. The weakness spreading through her limbs. The mental fog making it hard to think. The acceptance that death was coming, and perhaps that was fine. Perhaps it was time. On the 4th day, something changed. Maybe it was survival instinct. Maybe it was the memory of her mother's passive surrender to death and a desperate determination not to follow the same path. Maybe it was simply the warm spring sunlight filtering through the cellar stairs. Whatever the reason, Margaret Fischer climbed the stairs into daylight. The sunlight blinded her. She stood at the top of the cellar steps, one hand shielding her eyes, looking at a world transformed. The square was unrecognizable. Rubble had been pushed to the sides. American trucks lined the street. Soldiers moved with purpose, setting up tents, unloading supplies, speaking in their sharp foreign English. Everything moved fast. Americans did everything fast. They walked fast, talked fast, worked fast. It was disorienting after years of German military rigidity and the slow collapse of the final war months. She stood there swaying slightly, her dress hanging on her like fabric on wire. Her hair, once thick and dark, had grown brittle and dull. Her reflection in a broken window showed a stranger, hollow-eyed and gray, a ghost wearing clothes. And that's when she saw him. Sergeant William James Barker, of the 69th Infantry Division, 3rd Army. 31 years old. From a small farm outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. He had landed at Utah Beach 11 months earlier, June 1944, and fought his way across France through the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge across the Rhine River into Germany. He had seen towns like this before, dozens of them, bombed, burned, emptied of life. The pattern was always the same: ruins, survivors, displaced persons, and an overwhelming sense that civilization had committed suicide. But something about the woman in the square stopped him. She was kneeling in the rubble, digging with her bare hands, not frantically, but methodically, as if performing a ritual. Her movements were slow, careful, deliberate. She would lift a brick, examine the ground beneath it, sweep away dust with her fingers, then move to the next brick. She was searching for something. He watched her for a full minute before walking over. His combat boots crunched on broken masonry. She didn't look up, didn't react to his approach. She just kept digging. "What are you looking for?" he asked in English. She looked up. Her eyes were pale blue, startling in her thin face, the only part of her that still seemed alive. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Not hostile, not threatening, just curious. She held up a handful of dust and grain mixed together, showed it to him like evidence of something important, then let it fall through her fingers. The dust caught the sunlight as it fell. A few grains of wheat remained in her palm. Maybe 20 grains. Not enough to make a single biscuit. William understood immediately. He had grown up on a farm during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, when drought turned the Great Plains into a wasteland. He remembered his mother sweeping dust out of the house every morning. Dust in the food, dust in the water, dust in their lungs. He remembered neighbors abandoning their farms, loading everything they owned into trucks and heading west. He remembered his father standing in a ruined wheat field, watching the topsoil blow away like smoke, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. He knew what hunger looked like. Real hunger. The kind that turns people into ghosts. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a D-ration chocolate bar. Standard issue for American soldiers. 4 ounces of compressed chocolate oats and skim milk powder. The military called it the Logan bar after its inventor. Soldiers complained it tasted like dirt mixed with sugar, that it was designed to be barely palatable so troops wouldn't eat their emergency rations too quickly. But it was food. Real food. Approximately 600 calories per bar. He held it out to her. Margaret stared at the chocolate bar. She had not seen real food in weeks. Her hands remained at her sides. This was a trick. It had to be. German propaganda had spent years telling them Americans were savages, that occupation would mean brutality and theft, that American soldiers would rape and murder their way across Germany. Why would a soldier give her food? What would he want in return? William saw the fear in her eyes. He had seen it before in other liberated towns. The propaganda worked both ways. Germans feared Americans. Americans feared Germans. Everyone had been taught to hate everyone. He stepped closer, knelt down beside her in the rubble. He unwrapped the chocolate, broke off a piece, and ate it himself. "See," he said. "Safe. Not poisoned. Not a trick. Just food." Then he held out the rest. Her hand moved without conscious thought, reaching for the chocolate before her brain could overthink it. She took the bar. It felt heavy, substantial, real. She brought it to her mouth. The first taste made her eyes close. Sweetness. Richness. Calories. Her body awakened with desperate hunger. Every cell screamed for more. She forced herself to chew slowly, knowing that eating too fast after prolonged starvation could make her sick, but her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped it. The chocolate filled her mouth, coated her tongue, slid down her throat. She could feel her body responding, recognizing nutrition, beginning the long process of recovery. She ate half the bar in silence, while William watched. He had 2 more rations in his pack. He gave her both. Then he stood, said something in English she didn't understand. Something about rest and safety and tomorrow, and walked back to his jeep. She watched him go, still holding the wrapper, not quite believing what had happened. An American soldier had given her food. Not taken anything, not demanded anything, just given her food. The war had trained her to expect cruelty. This act of simple kindness felt revolutionary. That evening, in the temporary mess tent set up near the town square, William told his friend Corporal Daniel Reeves about the woman he had seen. Danny had grown up in Brooklyn, joined the army in 1942, survived Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge. He was cynical about most things, practical about survival, and deeply skeptical about German civilians. "You gave her your rations," Danny said. "It wasn't a question. She was starving," William said simply. "They're all starving," Danny replied. "You can't feed the whole country. We killed their soldiers, we bombed their cities, and now they're hungry. That's what happens when you start a war and lose." "I know," William said, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. Something in her eyes. Not just hunger, dignity. She had been someone before the war destroyed her. He could see it in the way she moved, careful and deliberate, even in desperation. The way she had knelt in that rubble, searching for grain, like an archaeologist, searching for artifacts, refusing to give up even when there was nothing left to find. Danny looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to go back tomorrow, aren't you?" "Yes," William said. "I am." Danny shook his head, but didn't argue. He had learned during the war that some men could witness suffering and move on, and some men couldn't. William was the second type. It would probably get him killed someday, but it also made him the kind of person Danny trusted with his life. The next morning, William went back to the square. She was there again in the same spot, digging in the same rubble. The image hit him like a punch. She hadn't given up. After everything, after losing everything, she was still trying to find food, still fighting to survive. He brought more rations. This time she didn't hesitate. She took them and ate while he watched. Her hands still shook, but less than yesterday. Color was returning to her face, just barely, like the first hint of dawn. He tried to speak to her in slow English, using simple words, but she only shook her head. The language barrier was complete. He needed a translator. He found one by asking around the military police checkpoints. An older German man named Herr Schmidt, who spoke broken but functional English. Schmidt had been a professor before the war teaching literature at Leipzig University, until the Nazis purged the faculty of anyone who wasn't enthusiastic enough about the Reich. He had survived by keeping his head down, teaching approved curriculum, never speaking against the regime. Now in occupation, his language skills made him valuable. Through Schmidt, William learned her name. Margaret Fischer, 23 years old, former schoolteacher, family dead, alone. Schmidt explained the situation with the tired efficiency of someone who had explained it 100 times before. Thousands of German civilians had no food, no shelter, no means of survival. The occupation forces provided basic rations at distribution centers, but supplies were limited and chaos reigned. Documentation was required. Registration forms. Proof of identity. For someone like Margaret, whose house had been destroyed, whose papers had been lost, whose family was dead, navigating the bureaucracy was nearly impossible. People fell through the cracks. Margaret was one of them. William made a decision that afternoon that would have gotten him court-martialed if his commanding officer had known. He started bringing Margaret food every day. Not just rations. Real food from the army mess. Bread, eggs, sometimes soup in a thermos. Items that wouldn't be missed from the abundant American supplies, but would mean life or death for a starving woman. He would find her in the square, sit with her while she ate, then leave. No expectations, no demands, just food. She began to gain weight. Slowly, very slowly. Her cheeks filled out slightly. Color returned to her face. The skeletal appearance faded. But more than physical recovery, something else was happening. She started to trust. This American soldier kept coming back, kept bringing food, never asked for anything in return, never touched her inappropriately, never threatened her, just helped. The concept was so foreign after years of Nazi ideology about strength and weakness, about racial superiority, and survival of the fittest, that it took her weeks to fully accept it. By the third week of May, she was strong enough to walk more than a few blocks without collapsing. William, on a rare afternoon off, showed her where the American supply depot had been set up. He introduced her to Red Cross workers distributing aid. He made sure she was registered for rations, navigated the bureaucracy on her behalf, used his status as an American soldier to cut through the red tape that had kept her trapped. He did all of this without fanfare, without expecting gratitude, without seeking recognition. One evening after he had walked her back to the cellar where she still lived, because there was nowhere else to go, she spoke to him in halting English. The interpreter Schmidt had been teaching her basic phrases, common words, simple grammar. Why, she asked. Why you help me? The question hung in the air between them. William was quiet for a long moment. The sun was setting behind the ruins of the town, painting everything gold and shadow. Long shadows stretched across rubble. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world was trying to be normal again, trying to pretend that everything hadn't just collapsed. He thought about his farm in Oklahoma, his mother's kitchen, the way she would feed anyone who showed up at their door during the Depression, hobos riding the rails, drifters looking for work, neighbors who had lost everything. His father would complain about wasting food they could barely afford to spare, but his mother never stopped. "Because people are hungry," she would say, as if that explained everything. "Because you needed help," William said finally to Margaret. It was the simplest answer, the truest answer. But for Margaret Fischer, who had spent years in a country that valued strength above compassion, that celebrated cruelty as necessity, that had built death camps and started a war that killed 60 million people, that answer was revolutionary. She looked at this American soldier, this man from Oklahoma, who had grown up on a farm and somehow retained his humanity through 11 months of combat, and felt something shift inside her. Hope. Fragile and terrifying, but hope nonetheless. "What happens when you leave?" she asked in careful English. "I don't know," William admitted. "But we'll figure it out." That promise made in broken English in the ruins of a German town was the beginning of everything, but neither of them knew yet how complicated keeping that promise would become, or how many obstacles would stand between a German woman and an American soldier building a life together. The summer of 1945 was coming, and with it would come decisions that would determine whether this fragile connection could survive the bureaucracy, prejudice, and distance that threatened to tear it apart. When we left off, Sergeant William Barker had just made an insane promise to Margaret Fischer. "Come with me to America." 3 words that sounded simple, but required navigating a bureaucratic nightmare that had defeated thousands of couples before them. The U.S. military had strict regulations about fraternization with enemy nationals. Marriage was theoretically possible, but the paperwork could take months or years, and time was running out. William's unit had orders to ship out in 3 weeks. If Margaret couldn't leave with him, she would be alone again in a devastated country with no family, no home, and no guarantee she would ever see him again. The failure rate for these wartime marriages was staggering. Of the estimated 100,000 relationships between American soldiers and German women in 1945, fewer than 15,000 resulted in successful immigration. The rest ended in separation, broken promises, and women left behind. William and Margaret were about to learn why those numbers were so brutal. And this is when everything became infinitely more complicated. The enemy wasn't the German army anymore. The war was over. The new enemy was bureaucracy, and it was more ruthless than any Wehrmacht division. William began his investigation the morning after proposing. His first stop was the company chaplain, Captain Robert Morrison, a Methodist minister from Michigan, who had performed dozens of marriages between American soldiers and European women. Morrison was sympathetic but honest. "The regulations are clear," he told William. "Marriage to a German national requires approval from your commanding officer, a background investigation of the bride proof. She's not a security risk. Medical examinations for both parties, and completion of Form WAC 14 through military channels." "How long does that take?" William asked. 3 to 6 months if everything goes smoothly," Morrison said. "And it never goes smoothly." William felt his stomach drop. 3 months minimum. His unit was shipping out in 3 weeks. "What if I marry her before we leave?" William asked. "Can she come with me then?" Morrison shook his head. "Marriage doesn't automatically grant immigration rights. She would still need a visa, still need approval from the State Department, still need to wait in Germany until all the paperwork cleared." "You're talking about leaving your wife behind in a war zone, son." William left the chaplain's office feeling defeated, but he wasn't the type to give up. He spent the next 2 days talking to everyone who might have answers. The Red Cross liaison, the military police administrator, the civil affairs officer responsible for displaced persons. Every conversation ended the same way. Possible but difficult. Complex but not impossible. legal but time-consuming. The regulations existed because the military didn't want soldiers making impulsive decisions, marrying women out of loneliness or lust, then abandoning them when reality set in. The vetting process was designed to protect both parties. But for William and Margaret, who had genuine feelings and limited time, the regulations felt like prison walls. On his third day of investigation, William found an unexpected ally. Major Thomas Henderson, executive officer of the 69th Infantry Division, 42 years old, career Army veteran of World War I. Henderson had a reputation for being a hard-ass about regulations, the kind of officer who would write you up for a crooked tie. William expected rejection. Instead, Henderson listened to his story, asked pointed questions about Margaret's background, then did something surprising. He picked up the phone and made 3 calls. By the end of the day, William had approval to begin the marriage process, an expedited investigation of Margaret Fischer, and a meeting scheduled with the Judge Advocate General's office to discuss visa options. "Why are you helping me?" William asked. Henderson looked at him with tired eyes that had seen too much war. "Because I was stationed in Germany after the First War," he said. "I saw what happened to the women left behind. Starvation, prostitution, suicide. If you're serious about this girl, if you're actually going to take care of her, then I'd rather help you do it right than watch another woman get abandoned. But understand this, Sergeant. If you marry her and leave her behind, if you make promises you don't keep, I will personally ensure you regret it. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear," Sir William said. Henderson leaned back in his chair. "Then let's figure out how to get your girl to Oklahoma." The background investigation began immediately. Margaret was questioned by military intelligence officers. Where was she during the war? What did her father do? Was anyone in her family a Nazi party member? Did she have any connection to war crimes? The questions were invasive, humiliating, necessary. Germany had committed atrocities. The occupation forces couldn't simply let anyone emigrate without vetting. Margaret answered everything honestly. Her father had paid Nazi party dues because every business owner had to. He had attended mandatory meetings, but he had never been enthusiastic, never worn the uniform, never reported anyone to the Gestapo. He had been a baker who wanted to feed his town and survive. The investigators checked her story against records salvaged from bombed municipal buildings. They interviewed neighbors who had survived. They verified her teaching credentials, confirmed her family's deaths, documented that she had no criminal record and no association with war crimes. The process took 6 days. 6 agonizing days while William's departure date crept closer. On June 18th, the report came back. Margaret Fischer. No security risk. Approved for marriage to U.S. military personnel. William felt relief flood through him. One obstacle down. But the visa process remained. That was controlled by the State Department, not the military, and it moved at the speed of continental drift. Major Henderson called in another favor. He contacted a State Department liaison officer attached to SHAEF Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The liaison explained the situation bluntly. Visa processing for German nationals typically takes 4 to 6 months. There are quotas. There are waiting lists. There are thousands of applications ahead of yours. Unless she has a sponsor in the United States, unless there's documented proof of marriage, unless there's clear evidence she won't become a public burden, she waits, like everyone else. "How do we make her not like everyone else?" Henderson asked. The liaison was quiet for a moment. "Marry her now," he said. "Get the marriage certificate. That moves her up the priority list. Then have Sergeant Barker's family in the United States sign an affidavit of support guaranteeing they'll provide for her financially. That shows she won't need public assistance. File everything simultaneously. Military marriage certificate, visa application, affidavit of support, medical clearance. If everything is perfect, if nothing gets lost, if no one makes a mistake, she might get approved in 2 to 3 months. Might." William sent a telegram to his parents in Oklahoma that night. "Need urgent favor. Please sign affidavit promising to support my future wife Margaret. We'll explain everything later. Trust me. The response came back 36 hours later. Signed papers in mail. Your mother says bring her home. We'll figure out the rest. William felt something loosen in his chest. His parents, who had never met Margaret, who barely understood what was happening, trusted him enough to sign legal documents promising to support a German woman they had never seen. Family meant something in Oklahoma. It meant you backed each other up even when you didn't fully understand. The wedding was arranged for June 27th, exactly 1 week before William's unit shipped out. Chaplain Morrison agreed to perform the ceremony in a small church on the outskirts of Torgau, one of the few buildings that hadn't been bombed. Margaret had nothing. No wedding dress, no family, no celebration. The Red Cross volunteers scrounged together a simple white dress, slightly too large, held together with safety pins. Herr Schmidt, the interpreter who had facilitated their first conversation, agreed to be a witness. Corporal Danny Reeves, William's friend, stood as best man. The ceremony was brief. Morrison spoke in English, then German, then English again. Do you, William James Barker, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? I do. Do you? Margaret Fischer, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? I do. By the power vested in me by the United States Army and the state of Michigan, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. William kissed her gently, carefully, like she might break. When they pulled apart, Margaret was crying. Not from sadness. From relief. From disbelief. From the impossibility of this moment existing. 2 months ago, she had been dying in rubble. Now, she was married to an American soldier who promised to take her to Oklahoma. After the ceremony, William took both of Margaret's hands in his. His face was serious, intense, protective. You're mine now, he said in English. Herr Schmidt translated, Du gehörst jetzt zu mir. You belong to me now. In German, the phrase carried different weight. Not possession. Protection. You are my family. You are my responsibility. I will take care of you. Margaret understood perfectly. She squeezed his hands. And you are mine, she said in careful English. We belong to each other. The paperwork began immediately. Margaret was now officially Mrs. Margaret Barker, spouse of a U.S. serviceman. That status changed everything. She received temporary identification papers. A visa application was submitted with priority processing. The marriage certificate. The affidavit of support from William's parents, medical clearances, showing she was free of tuberculosis and venereal disease. All of it went into a massive bureaucratic machine that ground slowly forward. But William's unit received final orders. Departure July 4th. Destination France. Then eventual redeployment to either occupation duty in Japan or demobilization back to the United States. William would be leaving. Margaret would stay behind. They had 6 days of marriage before separation. 6 days to build a foundation that would have to last months of uncertainty. William spent those 6 days ensuring Margaret would survive without him. He found her a room in a partially repaired boarding house run by a widow named Frau Hoffman, who needed the rent money. He registered her with the American Civil Affairs Office so she would receive food rations. He introduced her to every Red Cross worker, every military administrator, every person who might be able to help her if problems arose. He gave her money. All of his saved pay from 11 months of combat. $340 in military script, enough to live on for months if she was careful. He wrote out detailed instructions in both English and German. Who to contact if the visa was delayed, where to go if she needed medical help, how to reach him through military mail. He made her memorize his parents' address in Oklahoma. If anything happens to me, he said, write to them. They'll help you. Nothing will happen to you, Margaret said fiercely. You survived the whole war. You will survive going home. He smiled at her faith. Their last night together, they lay awake in her small room talking in a mixture of English and German, planning a future that felt impossibly distant. "What is Oklahoma like?" she asked. "Flat," he said. "Endless. You can see forever in every direction. The sky is so big it makes you feel small. In summer, the heat makes the air shimmer. In winter, the wind cuts through everything. It's not gentle like Germany, it's harsh. But it's beautiful in its own way." "I want to see it," Margaret said. "I want to see your sky." The morning of July 4th came too quickly. William's unit assembled for departure at dawn. Trucks lined the road, engines running, soldiers loading equipment with the efficient speed of men who had done this 100 times. Margaret stood by the convoy assembly point wearing the same white dress from their wedding. She had washed it carefully, ironed it with a borrowed iron heated on a wood stove, wanted to look her best for goodbye. William had 90 seconds. That's all the time his sergeant would allow. He held her face in his hands, memorized every detail. The pale blue eyes. The dark hair growing back thicker now that she was eating regularly. The small scar on her left cheek from childhood. The way her mouth trembled when she tried not to cry. "I love you," he said. He had never said it before. The words felt enormous, dangerous true. "I love you too," she said in English. The pronunciation was perfect. She had practiced. Then he was in the truck. The convoy was moving. Dust rose. Engines roared. Margaret stood on the road, one hand raised, watching him disappear into dust and distance. She stood there long after the convoy was gone. Long after the dust settled. Long after the sound of engines faded. Then she walked back to her room and began the hardest part. Waiting. Summer became autumn. Autumn became winter. The visa process crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Forms were lost. Interviews were rescheduled. Background checks were delayed. Her status as a German national, even as the wife of an American soldier, meant additional scrutiny. Every detail of her life was investigated again. Had her father really been non-political? Had she ever expressed Nazi sympathies? Were there any reasons to deny her entry to the United States? The investigators were thorough and suspicious. But Margaret was patient and honest. She worked as a translator for the American Occupation Administration, earning money, improving her English, staying busy. She wrote to William every week. Long letters describing her days, her progress with the paperwork, her dreams of Oklahoma. His letters came back irregularly. Mail from America was slow. Sometimes 3 letters would arrive at once. Sometimes weeks would pass with nothing. But when they came, she read them dozens of times, memorizing every word. He described his journey home, the ship across the Atlantic, the train from New York to Oklahoma, the farm looking exactly like he remembered, his parents excited to meet her, his father still skeptical but willing, his mother already treating her like a daughter. He sent photographs, the farmhouse, the barn, fields of wheat. She kept them in a tin box and studied them at night, trying to imagine herself in those landscapes. Winter in Torgau was brutal. February brought news. Her visa was approved. She could immigrate to the United States. Travel arrangements would be made through military channels. Train to Bremerhaven. Ship to New York. Train to Oklahoma. She cried when she read the approval letter. Deep, shaking sobs of relief and terror. She was leaving. Actually leaving. March 1946. The ship crossed the Atlantic in 12 days. Margaret was sick for most of the voyage, but she didn't care. She was moving toward something. Toward William. Toward life. New York Harbor appeared through morning fog. The Statue of Liberty rose like a promise. Ellis Island processed her with bureaucratic efficiency. Mrs. William Barker, permanent resident, destination Oklahoma. William met her at the Tulsa train station on March 15, 1946. 10 months since they had said goodbye. He looked different in civilian clothes, thinner, older. But when he saw her step off the train, his face broke into a smile that erased those 10 months. They stood on the platform, confirming each other was real. Then he pulled her into his arms. "You made it," he whispered. "You actually made it." "I promised I would wait," she said. "I promised I would stay strong." The drive to the farm took an hour. Dirt roads the color of rust. Fields of winter wheat just starting to green. The sky was enormous, cloudless, impossibly blue. Margaret had never seen so much open space. The farmhouse looked exactly like the photographs. But photographs couldn't capture the scale, the endless horizon, the way the wind moved through wheat like waves on an ocean. Sarah Barker Williams' mother was waiting on the porch. She looked at Margaret with a farmer's wife's practical assessment, then smiled. "Welcome home," she said. "Home." The word felt foreign and perfect. But Margaret's journey was just beginning. The paperwork was complete. The marriage was legal. She was in America. But being accepted as an American building a life in a country that had just finished fighting Germany, navigating the suspicion and prejudice that would follow her for years, that was the real battle. And in Part 3, we'll see how a German war bride survived small-town Oklahoma, how she transformed from enemy alien to beloved neighbor, and how one chocolate bar in 1945 created a family legacy that would span 4 generations and 80 years. The war was over. But the hard part was just beginning. We've followed William and Margaret from a chance meeting in rubble to a desperate marriage against bureaucratic odds. William gave her chocolate and saved her life. The U.S. military gave them paperwork and nearly broke them apart. But they survived. Margaret made it to America. She stood on Oklahoma soil as Mrs. William Barker, legal resident war bride survivor. But arrival wasn't acceptance. The paperwork said she belonged. The neighbors disagreed. And now the real battle began. Not against German soldiers or military regulations, but against something far more difficult to defeat. Prejudice. Suspicion. The lingering hatred of a town that had sent its sons to die fighting Germany. Margaret was about to learn that crossing an ocean was easy compared to crossing the divide between enemy and family. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about becoming American. And the people of rural Oklahoma weren't going to make it easy. The first confrontation came within a week of her arrival. William took Margaret into town to buy supplies at the general store. Claymore's Feed and Supply had served the community for 40 years. Everyone shopped there. It was where farmers gathered to discuss weather and wheat prices, where women bought fabric and flour, where the town conducted its informal business. Margaret walked in wearing a simple dress Sarah had lent her, her English now functional if accented. She stood close to William while he ordered supplies. The store went quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People stared. An older woman near the counter, Mrs. Dorothy Chen, whose son had died at Normandy, made a disgusted sound. "You brought a German here," she said loudly. "To our store." William's jaw tightened. "This is my wife, Margaret," he said calmly. "We just need to pick up some seed and supplies." "I don't serve Nazis," the store owner said. His name was Frank Claymore, 58 years old, veteran of World War I. His nephew had been killed in the Ardennes. "Get out." Margaret understood enough English to know what was happening. She felt her face burn with shame. William didn't move. "She's not a Nazi," he said. His voice was steel. "She's a schoolteacher whose family died in the bombing. She had nothing to do with the war." Claymore's face was red. "Every German had something to do with it. They started it. They killed our boys. Now you bring one here expecting us to smile and welcome her. She can starve for all I care." The store erupted in murmured agreement. Several people nodded. One man said something about sending her back where she came from. Margaret felt the walls closing in. This was worse than starvation. Worse than bombs. This was being hated for simply existing. Then Sarah Barker pushed through the crowd. William's mother, 60 years old, 5 feet 2 inches of Oklahoma steel. She walked straight to the counter and looked Frank Claymore in the eye. "This is my daughter-in-law," Sarah said quietly. "She is family. My son fought for 3 years so people could be free, including the freedom to start over. If you won't serve her, you won't serve any of us. We'll take our business to Morrison's in the next county. The Barker family had farmed this land for 40 years. They were good customers. Claymore hesitated. Other families would follow the Barkers. He couldn't afford to lose that business. He looked at Margaret with pure hatred, but stepped back. "Fine," he muttered. "But she stays quiet, and she stays out of my way." They bought their supplies in tense silence. Margaret kept her eyes down. When they left, she was shaking. "I am sorry," she said to William in the truck. "I am sorry I caused trouble." "You didn't cause anything," William said fiercely. "They're wrong. They'll learn." But he wasn't sure he believed it. The hostility continued for months. Some neighbors were kind. Most were cold. A few were openly hostile. At church, women whispered when Margaret walked by. At community gatherings, conversations stopped when she approached. Children were taught to avoid her. Parents didn't want their kids playing with the German woman's future children. The local pastor, Reverend Thomas Whitfield, visited the farm in April. He sat in the parlor and asked Margaret pointed questions about her faith. Had she been baptized Lutheran? Did she understand Baptist theology? Could she really claim to be Christian after what Germany had done to the Jews? Margaret answered in careful English, explaining she had known nothing about the camps, that her town had been small and isolated, that learning the truth had horrified her. Whitfield listened with skepticism. He didn't say she couldn't attend church, but he made clear she wasn't fully welcome. The message was obvious. Prove yourself, every single day, forever. Margaret threw herself into becoming invisible. She learned to cook American food by watching Sarah. Fried chicken, biscuits and gravy, cornbread, pecan pie. She practiced her English for hours, eliminating her accent as much as possible. She volunteered for every church committee that would have her, even the ones that made her uncomfortable. She attended every community event, smiled at everyone, never complained, never pushed back. She was trying to erase herself and rebuild as someone acceptable. William watched it happen and hated it. "You don't have to change who you are," he told her one night. "Yes, I do," she said simply. "If I want to survive here, I must become American. Not German American, just American." But summer brought a crisis that forced the town to see her differently. In June 1946, a polio outbreak hit the county. Polio, the disease that terrified parents more than anything else. It struck children seemingly at random, causing paralysis, death, lifelong disability. There was no cure, no vaccine, only isolation and prayer. The outbreak started in the town school. 3 children fell ill within a week, then 5 more, then 10. The school closed. Parents panicked. The county health department sent a nurse, but she was overwhelmed. She needed help, trained help. Someone who could assist with examinations, keep records, help enforce quarantine procedures. Margaret had been a teacher. She understood children. She spoke some German, which meant she could read medical texts in German that described polio treatment protocols developed in Europe. Most importantly, she volunteered when everyone else was afraid. The nurse, Helen Rodriguez, 34 years old, practical and exhausted, didn't care where Margaret came from. She needed hands. German hands were better than no hands. For 6 weeks, Margaret worked 16-hour days. She helped examine children. She taught parents how to recognize symptoms early. She kept meticulous records tracking the outbreak's spread. She assisted with the iron lungs when 3 children needed mechanical breathing assistance. She did the work that needed doing while the town that had shunned her watched. 11 children died. It was devastating. But the outbreak was contained. It didn't spread beyond the county. And when it was over, Helen Rodriguez wrote a letter to the local newspaper praising Margaret's work. "Without Mrs. Barker's assistance," she wrote, "we would have lost far more children." She worked tirelessly, asking nothing in return, demonstrating the kind of courage and compassion this community values. The letter changed something. Not everything, but something. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, whose son had died at Normandy, approached Margaret after church one Sunday. "My granddaughter was one of the children you helped," she said stiffly. "She lived because of you." "Thank you." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "You are welcome," she said. "I am glad she is well." It wasn't friendship, but it was acknowledgement. Margaret existed as more than just the enemy. The real turning point came in February 1947. Margaret was pregnant. The news transformed the family dynamics in ways paperwork never could. James Barker Williams' father, who had remained reserved and distant, suddenly became attentive. A grandchild was coming. German or not, this was his blood. The pregnancy was difficult. Margaret suffered terrible morning sickness for months. The Oklahoma heat in July and August was brutal, far worse than anything she had experienced in Germany. She spent weeks barely able to eat, losing weight instead of gaining it, worrying constantly that something was wrong with the baby. Sarah stayed with her every day, taught her about American pregnancy customs, took her to a doctor in Tulsa when the local doctor refused to see a German woman, held her hand during the worst days, and told her stories about her own pregnancies to distract her from the fear. The baby was due in late February. But February brought an ice storm. Oklahoma ice storms are legendary. Freezing rain coats everything in inches of ice. Roads become impassable. Power lines snap. The world becomes a dangerous frozen prison. Margaret went into labor on February 12th at 2 in the morning. William tried to drive to town to get the doctor. The truck slid off the road within half a mile. The roads were sheet ice. No one could get in or out. Sarah took charge. She had delivered calves, foals, piglets. She had assisted at neighbors' home births before hospitals were common. She knew what to do. The labor lasted 14 hours. Margaret screamed in German, reverting to her native language under stress. Sarah talked her through each contraction in calm English. A bizarre bilingual conversation happening in a freezing farmhouse, with no doctor, no hospital, no backup plan. William paced in the kitchen, useless and terrified. Finally, at 4:15 in the afternoon, James Friedrich Barker was born. Small, red, perfect, screaming with healthy lungs. Sarah cleaned him, wrapped him in blankets, handed him to Margaret. "You did it," Sarah said. "He's beautiful." William came into the room, saw his son, and started crying. He had survived 11 months of combat without crying once. But seeing his son born in the same farmhouse where he had been born broke something open. James Barker. William's father held his grandson that evening and cried too. It was the first time William had seen his father cry. All his skepticism, all his reservation, all his distance melted. This was his grandchild. Nothing else mattered. Not Germany, not the war, not prejudice. Just family. The town's attitude shifted after James was born. Margaret wasn't just the German war bride anymore. She was Mrs. Barker Williams' wife, mother of the Barker grandchild. People still whispered. Some still disapproved. But a baby made things real in a way marriage certificates hadn't. Babies were innocent. They deserved community support. And Margaret came with the baby. By spring 1947, Margaret had been in Oklahoma for a year. She could speak English fluently with only a slight accent that people found charming rather than threatening. She knew everyone's names, their families, their stories. She baked pies for church fundraisers using her mother's German recipes, adapted with American ingredients. She volunteered at the school where she had once taught in Germany. She was building a life brick by brick, smile by smile, pie by pie. 3 more children followed. Elizabeth in 1949, Thomas in 1952, Sarah in 1955, named after William's mother. The farmhouse filled with noise and life. Margaret taught her children German, but they spoke English. They were American completely. She made sure of that. They would never face the suspicion she had faced. They would never be foreign. William expanded the farm steadily, bought adjacent land when neighbors retired, invested in new equipment. The post-war economy boomed. Wheat prices were good. The farm prospered. They added indoor plumbing, bought a television, got a telephone. Modernity arrived in installments. By 1955, 10 years after the war, Margaret had become simply Mrs. Barker. The German part faded into background. She was the woman who helped during the polio outbreak, the mother of 4 children, the wife of a respected farmer, the woman who made excellent apple strudel and volunteered at every school event. She belonged. But she never forgot the journey. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch and remember Torgau, the square where she had knelt in rubble, her parents, her brother who died at Stalingrad, the girl she had been starving and alone, and the American soldier who had given her chocolate and with it a future. In 1955, they received a letter from Germany, from Herr Schmidt, the interpreter who had witnessed their wedding. Torgau had been rebuilt. The bakery was gone, replaced by concrete apartment blocks. The town looked nothing like Margaret remembered. He enclosed photographs. Margaret looked at them for a long time. Everything had changed. Everyone she had known was dead or scattered. The past was truly gone. That evening, she placed the photographs in the tin box where she kept William's letters from 1945. The ones that had sustained her through the waiting. The ones that had promised her a future. William found her holding the box. "You never talk about it much," he said. "The war. What happened to you?" "What is there to say?" she asked. "It happened. It's over." "But it's not over for you," he said. "Not really." She was quiet for a long time. "No," she said finally. "It will never be over. But I have learned to carry it." She told her children edited versions. When James asked why she had an accent, she said she came from Germany. When Elizabeth asked if she had been in the war, she said yes, but not the way soldiers were. When Thomas asked if she had been scared, she said yes always, but she never told them the full story. Never described the hunger, the collapse, the moment when an American soldier had offered her chocolate and without knowing it, offered her survival. Some stories were too heavy to pass down. The town that had rejected her eventually embraced her. By the time she died in 2005 at 83, she was beloved. Her obituary didn't mention she was German. It didn't mention the war. It didn't mention that she had once been starving in rubble. But her children knew. Her grandchildren knew. And at her funeral, they told the story. Not the whole story, not the darkest parts, but the essential truth. She had been lost. He had found her. Together, they built a life that mattered. But what happened to William the sergeant who started it all with a chocolate bar? What became of the man who saw a starving woman and chose compassion over indifference? In Part 4, we'll discover the final chapter of their story, the legacy that stretched across 4 generations, and the lesson that still resonates 80 years later. The battle for belonging was won. But the story isn't over yet. We've traveled through an impossible journey, from rubble in a bombed German town to wheat fields in Oklahoma, from a starving woman weighing 78 pounds to a mother of 4 building a life in a foreign country, from an American sergeant with a chocolate bar to a husband who fought bureaucracy harder than he ever fought the Wehrmacht. William and Margaret survived the war, survived the paperwork, survived the prejudice. They built a family. They built a farm. They built a life that seemed on the surface ordinary. But what happened next? What became of the man who chose compassion when the world chose cruelty? What legacy did a single act of kindness leave behind? This final chapter has a twist. Nobody expected. Because success doesn't always look like victory, and sometimes the most important battles are the ones nobody remembers. Because what William and Margaret created together went far beyond one marriage, one family, one farm. It became something that would echo through 80 years and 4 generations, teaching lessons about humanity that the world desperately needed to learn. William Barker lived a quiet life after the war. No medals for giving away chocolate. No commendations for marrying a German woman. No recognition for fighting bureaucracy to bring his wife home. He returned to Oklahoma, took over the family farm, and spent 44 years growing wheat and raising children. The Army discharged him in August 1945 with an honorable service record, a combat infantryman badge, and a Bronze Star he never talked about. He had landed at Utah Beach, fought through France, survived the Battle of the Bulge, crossed the Rhine into Germany. He had done his duty. That was all he ever said about it. His children knew fragments, that he had been a sergeant, that he had fought in Europe, that he had seen terrible things he wouldn't describe. But he never spoke about combat, never told war stories at community gatherings, never joined the Veterans of Foreign Wars post in town. The war was over. He had survived. He wanted to forget. What he did talk about occasionally was meeting their mother, how she had been kneeling in rubble searching for grain, how she had been so thin he could see her bones through her dress, how giving her that chocolate bar had felt like the most important thing he had done in 11 months of war. More important than any battle. More important than any medal. Because it had saved one specific person he could see and touch and love. The farm prospered under his management. He was a good farmer, patient, and methodical. He invested in new equipment slowly, never overextending, never taking unnecessary risks. By the 1960s, the Barker farm was one of the most productive in the county. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. They sent all 4 children to college. James became an engineer. Elizabeth became a teacher like her mother. Thomas took over the farm. Sarah became a nurse. All 4 married. All 4 had children. The family grew. But William's health declined in his 60s. The war had left invisible scars. He had breathed too much smoke, carried too much weight, seen too much death. Heart problems developed. The doctor said he had maybe 5 years. He had 11. He died in 1989 at 75 years old. Heart failure quick and relatively painless. He died on the farm where he had been born, in the same bedroom looking out at wheat fields under an Oklahoma sky. Margaret was with him at the end. So were their children. His last words were in German, learned imperfectly over 44 years of marriage. Ich liebe dich. I love you. Margaret held his hand until he stopped breathing. Then she sat with him for an hour, remembering everything. The square in Torgau, the chocolate bar, the 3 words that had changed everything. You're mine now. He had kept that promise for 44 years. Margaret lived 16 more years without him. She stayed on the farm, though Thomas ran it now. She spent her days gardening, reading, visiting her children and grandchildren. She volunteered at the local library. She taught conversational German to high school students who wanted to learn. She baked her mother's recipes and taught them to her granddaughters. She was beloved in the community by then. The German war bride who had once been shunned was now an honored elder. People asked her to speak at schools about her experiences. She always declined. The memories were too heavy, too private. But in 1995, for the 50th anniversary of the war's end, she agreed to one interview with the local newspaper. The reporter asked her what she remembered most about the war. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I remember being so hungry I couldn't think. I remember digging in rubble for grain that wasn't there. I remember believing I would die and not caring anymore. And then I remember an American soldier giving me chocolate. That's what I remember. Not the battles, not the bombing, not the politics. Just kindness when I had given up hope." The reporter asked if she had ever regretted coming to America. Margaret looked out the window at Oklahoma fields stretching to the horizon. "I regretted nothing," she said. "This became my home. These people became my family. My husband gave me a life I never thought I would have. How could I regret that?" She died in 2005 at 83 years old. Spring. The wheat was just starting to green. She died in the same farmhouse where she had first arrived 60 years earlier, surrounded by children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Her obituary in the local paper was brief. Margaret Barker, beloved wife. Mother, grandmother preceded in death by husband. William Barker survived by 4 children, 12 grandchildren, 7 great-grandchildren. Services at First Baptist Church. Donations to the local food bank in lieu of flowers. It didn't mention she was German. It didn't mention the war. It didn't mention she had once been starving in rubble. But her family knew, and they told the story at her funeral. The legacy of William and Margaret Barker wasn't measured in medals or monuments. It was measured in lives. 4 children, 12 grandchildren, 7 great-grandchildren by the time Margaret died. By 2025, 80 years after William gave Margaret that chocolate bar, the family has grown to over 40 descendants. Engineers, teachers, farmers, nurses, soldiers, artists. They live across America. Oklahoma, California, Texas, New York. They married into other families, creating connections, building communities. One of Margaret's great-granddaughters, Emma Barker, joined the Army in 2018. She deployed to Germany as part of NATO forces. While stationed there, she visited Torgau. The town had been rebuilt completely after German reunification. Nothing remained from 1945. The square, where Margaret had knelt, was now a pedestrian shopping area. The bakery site was a clothing store. But Emma stood there anyway, thinking about her great-grandmother searching for grain in rubble, about her great-grandfather stopping to help. She posted a photo on social media with the caption, "80 years ago. In this spot, my great-grandfather gave my great-grandmother a chocolate bar and saved her life. Now I'm here as a soldier protecting the peace they fought for." Funny how history works. The post went viral. Over 1 million people shared it. The story of William and Margaret Barker spread across the internet, picked up by news outlets, discussed on military forums, turned into countless articles about kindness during war. People were hungry for stories of humanity in the midst of atrocity. The comments were revealing. Veterans wrote about similar acts of compassion they had witnessed or performed. Descendants of war brides shared their family stories. People from Germany wrote about their own relatives who had survived because of American soldier kindness. One comment stood out. It was from a man named Klaus Fischer living in Berlin. He had researched his family tree and discovered his great-uncle had been named Klaus Fischer, died at Stalingrad in 1943. His great-aunt had been named Margaret Fischer, emigrated to America in 1946. He had never known what happened to her. For 70 years his family thought she had died in the bombing. They had no idea she had survived, married, built a life in Oklahoma. The internet reconnected family separated by 80 years of silence. Klaus visited Oklahoma in 2019. He met Margaret's children, now in their 70s. They shared photographs, letters, stories. They discovered they were cousins. The war had torn the family apart. The internet brought them back together. But the real lesson of William and Margaret's story wasn't about technology or family reunions. It was about choice. In May 1945, William Barker had a choice. Walk past the starving woman. Stay safe. Stay uninvolved. Avoid complications. Most soldiers made that choice. They had their own problems, their own trauma, their own desire to survive and go home. William chose differently. He stopped. He looked at Margaret as a person, not as an enemy national. He gave her food when he had no obligation to do so. He helped her navigate bureaucracy when it would have been easier to leave. He married her despite regulations and prejudice. He brought her to America and defended her against a hostile community. Every single one of those choices was difficult. Every single one carried risk. And every single one created ripples that spread across 80 years. Margaret had choices too. She could have given up in that rubble, could have accepted death as inevitable, could have refused help from an enemy soldier out of pride or fear, could have stayed in Germany where language and culture were familiar, could have returned to Germany when the prejudice in Oklahoma became unbearable. She chose to survive, chose to trust, chose to adapt, chose to become American without erasing who she had been. Chose to build something new instead of mourning what was lost. Those choices created a family. That family created more families. Those families contributed to their communities. Teachers who educated thousands of students. Nurses who saved lives. Farmers who fed people. Engineers who built things. Soldiers who served. The impact compounds across generations in ways impossible to calculate. But here's what we know for certain: that one chocolate bar in May 1945 led to 43 descendants by 2025. Those descendants have their own children, their own careers, their own contributions. The mathematics of compassion are staggering. One act of kindness multiplies across time in ways the original actor never sees. William never knew he would have 7 great-grandchildren. Margaret never met most of her great-grandchildren. But their choices in 1945 created possibilities that continue to unfold. There's one final detail most people don't know. In 2018, a researcher at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans discovered something in archived military records. Sergeant William James Barker had been recommended for the Medal of Honor in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. He had single-handedly held a position against German attack, allowing his unit to retreat safely. He had killed or wounded an estimated 17 enemy soldiers. He had been wounded himself, but refused evacuation until his men were safe. His commanding officer submitted the paperwork, but it was lost in the chaos of the Ardennes offensive. By the time records were reconstructed, William had been discharged and returned to civilian life. The recommendation was filed away, forgotten. When the researcher discovered this, he contacted the Barker family. Did they want to petition the Army to review the case, possibly award the medal posthumously? The family discussed it. Then they declined. Their father never wanted recognition for killing. He never talked about combat. He never sought glory. What he had been proud of, what he had talked about, was saving one woman in a ruined town, giving her chocolate, bringing her home, building a life together. That was his medal. The family asked instead that the museum include William and Margaret's story in their collection, not as a military achievement, as a human one. The museum agreed. In 2020, the National World War II Museum opened an exhibit called Small Acts Lasting Peace, featuring stories of compassion during war. William and Margaret's story is the centerpiece. Visitors can see the tin box Margaret kept with William's letters, one of William's uniform buttons, a photograph of them on their wedding day in that small church in Torgau. The description reads, "In the midst of total war, small acts of human kindness created futures that would otherwise never exist." This is one of those stories. Over 2 million people have visited the exhibit. The museum reports it's one of the most photographed displays. People stand in front of it crying. Veterans bring their grandchildren and tell them this is what service really means. Not just fighting, protecting, helping, building peace. From a farm boy with a chocolate bar to a legacy that spans 80 years and touches millions. William Barker proved that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons. Margaret Fischer proved that survival requires not just strength, but the courage to trust, to change, to start over. Together, they demonstrated something the world needed desperately in 1945, and still needs today. That enemies can become family. That compassion is stronger than hatred. That one person choosing kindness can create ripples that spread across generations. 43 descendants and counting. Thousands of students taught. Hundreds of lives saved by nurses and doctors in the family. Communities strengthened by farmers and engineers. And all of it traced back to one moment in May 1945 when a sergeant stopped his jeep, looked at a starving woman, and made a choice. The chocolate bar cost him nothing. The choice cost him everything. And it was worth it. Because when the bombs stop falling and the soldiers go home, what remains is not the destruction, but what we build afterward. The families we create, the compassion we show, the futures we make possible through simple human decency. That's the real victory. That's what wins wars that soldiers can never finish. William and Margaret understood that. They lived it. And 80 years later, their story still teaches us the most important lesson of any war. That peace isn't just the absence of fighting. It's the presence of people choosing to see humanity in each other even when everything tells them not to, especially then. That's the legacy of a chocolate bar. That's the power of choosing compassion over cruelty. And that's why this story among millions from World War II deserves to be remembered.